Yes, and that point was something that was really startling to me when after I made the transition into coaching. Well, I always ask when I'm working with a new athlete, what is your dream goal? And, I in the beginning, I always expected some big answer.
Yeah.
I want to go to the Olympics, or I want to be in the Tour de France. And every time I was shocked by what someone would say. All the goals are different.
Yeah.
All the dreams are different. Some people are just, as you say, well, I want to see where I can get to next.
Yeah.
And then they get there, and then I want to see where we get to next. And even when I provide them with a safe environment of, look, I'm not going to talk to anyone about your dreams. They don't have to be realistic. Just what are they? Even when I pitch it like that, sometimes it's as simple as systematic improvement.
How much of your potential are you leaving on the table? How much of your training are you leaving to chance? Are your periodized workouts the right one for your phenotype? What the heck's a phenotype? If you're wondering how to take your performance to the next level, maybe it's time to start thinking about a coach. And that's why I brought Beth Leasure-Hudson to the Athlinks Podcast. We jump around quite a bit and talk about how Beth uses tools like Training Peaks and Whoop to measure and track performance, rest, and heart rate to guide the workouts of herself and the athletes that she coaches. We talk about the importance of knowing your phenotype and structuring your workouts around maximizing your strengths. And we talk about her own cycling journey through self-doubt, discovery, and delight in the world of cycling. So if you're ready for the show, crank it up and let's go. Welcome to the Athlinks Podcast. I am your host, Troy Bousseau, coming to you from the sunny streets of Broomfield, Colorado. It is December 18th, and this is episode 22. Hello, Beth. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Troy?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Indeed.
I feel very privileged to be here.
Well, the privilege is all mine. So today on the podcast, we have Beth Leasure-Hudson. You are an elite level, well, describe I don't know if it's elite level, pro level coach, but a cycling coach and an elite level rider. So maybe pro coach, elite rider. Did I get that right?
Yes, more or less. I would just call myself a competitive cycling coach, and occasionally I get to work with elites and pros.
Perfect.
And then I'm an elite age grouper.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Cool, excellent. Well, you you sort of took 2020 and just said, hold my beer. I can up this ante big time. So you've had two very interesting side roads in 2020. You caught COVID, put you out for a little bit. You came all the way back to the point that you actually hit some PBs, your power highs. So you were maxing out your power. So you not only recovered, but you bettered yourself. Just in time then to get T-boned and gang tackled by a herd of deer going 26 miles per hour on your gravel bike, although I'm happy to report the bike survived, which is great. Broke your pelvis and achieved a power high again.
Yes. It's been two double comeback stories.
Yeah, well, we rarely get one in a lifetime, much less two. So it's cool. So I want to dig deep into that. And basically, so let me back up just a hair here. So the premise, you were connected to me through Training Peaks, and Training Peaks is right up the road. Full disclosure, Training Peaks is not paying for this. They're not sponsoring it in any way. We're good friends with them as a business and professionally and personally. We love those guys, but any opinions or otherwise expressed here in the podcast will be completely unfettered by the evils of capitalism. So feel free to give your full unfettered opinion on that. But my main premise when I reached out to them to try to connect me with some people was, we all sort of have this intuition about coaching and nutrition. We know coaching is good. We know nutrition is good. It's not like you would ever put your kids in a football league without a coach and just let them run around like savages. And And yet I know a lot of people with $10,000 bikes that don't use a coach. I know a lot of people with or $220 carbon racing flats that don't take their nutrition seriously. So I kind of wanted to enlighten myself, because I know I need a coach, and yet I've only had one for a brief period in my athletic career. So part of this is a little bit hoping somebody out there can sell me on, getting a coach and taking all of this a little bit more seriously and showing me the benefits of that. But for you, like, you're clearly a coach who's out there eating your own dog food. It's kind of a product term for, like, you're practicing what you preach. You can look at your results, your 2 comeback stories this year, hitting, achieving power highs both times. And so I just wanted to kind of get with you, talk about the benefits of working with a coach, the benefits of working with a tool like Training Peaks and logging that stuff, and just logging your KOMs on Strava doesn't count, like actually getting into a tool and digging in and analyzing the data and things. So that's a little bit of background on why I wanted to have you on and what I hope to accomplish today for the show.
Okay, that sounds great.
Yeah. So let's take a bigger step back even then. So we're going back through time. So how did you get here? How did you kind of arrive at the elite level of coaching and performance?
I started, like most people do, as an older rider in America. I started riding because someone told me to exercise for my mental health. I was coping with a life setback, a relational setback as a younger woman in my late 20s. And someone said, why don't you exercise while you wait to heal from that and wait to see kind of what your purpose is. And what was ironic about that is part of the stress I was dealing with and the trauma I was coping with had to do with some financial losses. So I didn't have a lot of options, but I did have this heavy bike in my parents' barn, this old steel Schwinn, and started to ride it and rode it about 15 minutes and thought, boy, is that great. And then I got up to 3 miles or something and thought that was tremendous. And then I started seeing these strange people on bikes in Lycra in groups that were a fashion statement. And it strangely excited me.
Okay.
I was also inspired by quite a few athletes in the years prior to that, just kind of their comeback stories. And I was very fortunate. I fell into a group ride scenario, and the club members were friendly, and they got me involved, and they got me better equipment, and it kind of took off from there. Cycling is about community. Sport can be about community. Their concern for me helped me heal. Physical exercise just helps you mentally, no matter where you are and what you're dealing with. And there were some spiritual aspects of it that were healing for me because there was a flow in it. I was seeing provision. I was seeing vision. I was having a vision of what it could lead to. And so there was a spiritual healing that, in the sense that you can make a mistake, you can make a bad choice, or you can have bad choices thrust upon you, and there's still a redemption.
Interesting. So this kind of initial part of the journey, from finding the steel bike to getting into the club to getting kind of an unofficial sponsorship where you've got, kind of a benefactor giving you some gear and upgrading some components. What is the time frame here? Is this a year in, 10 years in? Months?
Oh, no, it was months.
Yeah.
I went from riding with them in the summer. By that winter, there was a women's specific learn to race clinic. Very rare phenomenon in those days. It's still a rare phenomenon, and put on by some very capable women in the Washington, D.C. metro area. And after 12 weeks, I felt pretty confident
Wow.
about getting in a mass start environment.
So what year was this, roughly?
1991.
Okay. Very specifically
Yeah.
then. So was this all road cycling at this point?
Yes.
Road cycling. Okay. And so 3 months, basically 3 months in, 12-week program, you had mentioned some redemption stories that had caught your eye in the past. Are we talking like kind of the NBC Wide World of Sports Ironman type stories, or what where did that fall in with you?
Honestly, I was inspired by a baseball player named Oral Hershiser.
Oh yeah.
I think he pitched a perfect game in the World Series. And I don't think at that point, I think he was a consistent person. He wasn't a superstar, but he was a consistent person who worked hard and who had a lot of faith.
Mm.
And that was inspiring.
Interesting. Okay.
And
Okay.
then I honestly, some of the stress that had been dealing with relationally had to do with a marriage that failed, and the reasons it failed was because my husband had a drug addiction, and I was pretty naive about all that, so coming to terms with that as a spiritual person, what does that mean for me moving forward? Is that a lifelong mistake? Can I overcome it? And I had so many examples of admirable men from my local cycling community. I know you don't hear that very often, but I really had that, and it was inspiring to me. It was healing.
Okay, so you were sort of taking some of the blame on of your husband's transgressions and then wondering if you could sort of redeem yourself from that, and then you start to come in contact with these, as you say, admirable men in the cycling community around you.
Yes,
That's interesting.
Men and women, men and women. But I was healing from a male wound, from a relationship wound.
Got it.
My husband betrayed me in his drug addiction, as addicts do. They betray their loved ones. And the blame I was taking on myself is, why did I make this choice in the first place?
Got it.
And how was I going to recover from it?
Got it. And so was there there's kind of two ways to look at exercise and cycling and things like that, is the sort of meditative aspects of it on one hand, and just living in your mind and being able to process those things in a, carve out an hour, 5 hours, whatever the time frame may be of where you're really in your own head. There's that side. And then there's the achievement side, where all of a sudden you are pushing yourself mentally and physically to places that you've never been before. Which side did you lean toward, or were you right down the middle in your own redemption story?
I think another factor that needs to be mentioned is the power of community coming alongside you to help you, and that's what great coaching is. To segue back to that idea,
okay.
Yeah, the coaching that I was getting wasn't formal at that point. I guess you could sort of call the coaching that I got in the women's race clinic as formal coaching, because that's what they were there to do. They were there to teach us. But a lot of what I got was just informal friendship and community and assistance, learning what is a complex athletic activity from these people I was seeing, multiple times a week at that point. On group rides and little trips and stuff.
Yeah. Were you it sounds like you were relatively isolated from that, like in your marriage or even growing up. You hadn't been around this type of community in the past.
No, not. I had some high school cross-country running experience, but I got injured and I didn't have sports type parents who knew how to help me through that. So I just quit because I thought, well, I'm injured. I can't do this. I didn't know you can rehab and actually come back better. like
Wow.
in 2020.
Yeah, I was going to say the irony exists now for sure. So you start to build this community. You start to see a sort of another way forward. I like that. Yeah, you're right. I that was a glaring omission where I kind of lived within. I think that speaks to, I guess, who I am when it comes to these things. A little bit more of a loner and introvert. But the side that you mentioned, the communal side, the community building side of the cycling aspects, and where coaching fits in with that. And so you go through this program, and now you're staring up at your first race. That had to have been, I mean, given what you just sort of walked us through with, very little involvement in this and exposure to this all of a sudden, were you a competitive person going into this phase of your life? Would you have considered yourself competitive?
I'm a competitive person, yes, in the sense that I want to push myself toward excellence. And sometimes if that involves comparison with peers, so be it. But mostly it's an internal drive to be excellent.
Okay.
And so from that sense, yeah, I was competitive. I was like that in school. I was like that for job opportunities. So that part of it wasn't new to me.
Okay.
What was new to me was school and job achievement. For me, came so much easier than athletic achievement, especially in the beginning. And so, yes, I had some basic race skills, which was more than perhaps entry category beginning racers did in those days, who didn't go through that a women's, race skills clinic. But I was still dropped in the parking lot. It was a training race, and I was literally dropped. And there was a big group there, and they started fast, and they were gone before I got out of the parking lot.
Wow.
So my goal was the next week to make it to the first turn, and then the week after that to make it down the first straightaway after the first turn. And I just kept segmenting my achievement with those tiny little steps.
Wow. And so
Yeah.
how are you thinking about like training and putting those things together? Is it just kind of like sheer willpower at this point, trying to stay up with the group? Are you being scientific at all? Was that kind of an initial part of how you thought about cycling?
I would say that segmenting overwhelming things down into small steps is probably a personal strength, but I had no idea how to train. I had no idea how to even set myself up for the race start. Strategically, tactically. I mean, it's one thing to go out and practice learning how to corner and do a little pace line work. It's another to know what are the tactics, strategies, and technical skills necessary to successfully navigate the start of a mass start event.
Yeah. And so,
because in life, you just don't go from 0 to as hard as you can immediately.
Right. Yeah. Well, and so many times just putting more force behind something might just be sending you faster in the wrong direction, right?
Yes, right.
Yeah. And so that first race, you get dropped in the parking lot literally before the race has even begun. Second week, you get dropped on the first corner, let's say. What's happening in between the two races? Are you starting to up your training? Are you starting to ask questions? Like, how did you approach the deficiency and bridging that gap?
I started reading whatever books were available, talking to local racers, because the more I got involved in the community, the more information, I guess, was available to me at that time. But I still didn't have any concept about periodized training or training specific to your strength, your body type, or anything like that. There was not a lot of information available to me at that time. I know that I got a rudimentary training program from a local racer because in that first season I got sick, probably from overtraining, and I came back from that sickness too quickly, did too much, and and got a little sicker. So they said, you need to read up more about this. And they sort of sketched me out a plan and gave me some basic rules. But it was a long time before I got really good advice about how to train.
Okay.
So it was all sort of on the fly kind of experiential learning.
Okay.
And then I was loving it. So I was just riding more. I was doing more group rides. I was doing harder group rides. I was finding better group rides, whatever group rides I could find to do that were harder, whatever racing I could do with my club team. It was all about gaining experience, which is not something I always recommend at this point, because you can get a lot of experiences that teach you how to be pack fodder. What you want are quality experiences that are stepwise, a progression of your skills, technically, tactically, but also mentally, how to handle performance pressure, and what are the skills needed to be at the front? Very different than what are the skills needed to be in the race.
Yeah, you and I talked the other day when we started this, and one of the, I think, concerns that you might have had was that the way that coaching and the science around coaching and performance and all of these things tends to change. It's not just what worked 30 years ago. These things hopefully advance through time. And so you didn't want to get into a situation where you were giving advice that then becomes sort of obsolete over the next few months here as people continue to download the podcast. But as you look back at that and you think about coaching, things like what you just said, where you sort of pack fodder versus leading from the front, and there's obviously front running versus running from the back is a very different set of strategies and tactics. When you're coaching somebody, and we'll get deeper into the coaching side, I think, a little bit later, but when you're coaching somebody, do certain athletes just have certain predispositions to, you should always front run if you're this type of an athlete, or you're a better sprinter at the end, that type of thing? Like, how much of that comes into the equation when you're coaching a specific athlete?
Well, before we had really fine metrics from Training Peaks and their partner software, WKO5 now, version 5, we didn't, or at least I didn't understand physiologically this idea of phenotype in those days. I mean, we kind of all roughly do, where we say, oh yeah, such and such is a sprinter and such is a climber. But we didn't have sort of the data to back that up. Now we have better metrics that we up to date. If you put good data in the model, you get good data out, and you can help an athlete determine that more or less early. Even so, if I have a climber and they're a climber phenotype and they want to road race, they still need to know how to navigate a pack sprint, because in a climbing situation at a high level, you have to have pack sprint kind of knowledge to navigate, to get the whole shot, if you will, into the climb. You have to have that kind of pack fighting skill to know how to get the good position going into the climb. And we've seen that in tours in recent years with GC riders who had to fight on strange race stage days, like cobbled days, where their position helped determine the GC, or at least help them not lose the GC, by having kind of like a sprinter pack skills kind of mentality. So what I try to do is, in addition to the physical, the training based on their physiology, their true physiology, their strengths, I also try to teach them a broad base of skills at the lowest level that we can do that. Because if you keep moving up the categories quickly, it's just going to be harder to learn those basic skills. Your competitors are better and better.
Okay.
So why not learn them at the bottom? At the same time, it builds confidence, and you learn a dominant mentality versus a pack fodder mentality. There's less pressure. No one's really watching you if you're a Cat 5, 4, 3.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you're a star junior, if you stay in your age categories for a while and avoid sort of experiential race selection and work on those skills, when the time comes for you to go up to, say, national team or an elite level stage race where you might be racing with adult men, then you have the skill. It's already there and you're confident about it. You're not trying to learn the skill with, let's say you're a 16-year-old junior who weighs 140. You're not trying to learn that skill with a 180-pound man.
Okay. So let's take a step back then about the phenotype. So one, kind of give me the definition and how you determine a phenotype. And then it sounds like you're saying almost kind of delay that a little bit and don't focus so much on that in the beginning, but really build the more general skills. So let's talk about phenotype for a second.
Well, phenotype really is a physiological term, and it's determined by your strengths after testing. It's all in a program, a software program, and honestly, I'm going to leave that up to other experts you interview to talk about the science of that.
Okay. But like, what do the tests look like? What kind of testing am I going to be taking to determine my phenotype?
Well, the basic power duration curve testing is typically a sprint test, a 1-minute test, a 5-minute test, a 20-minute test.
Okay.
You can get the power duration curve, four separate tests really gets you a solid curve. But the data from your own training and racing also feeds the curve. But you do want max efforts. And from that body of data, it spits out a prediction of what you're going to be better at than others. So if the power duration curve is a hyperbolic curve that obviously the shorter the time, the more power you can put out. Over time, the more time, the less power. So the curve falls, and it's high in the beginning, and it falls on a curve, and then it goes flat because, in theory, we can hold a certain power for infinity, right? Mm-hmm. It's our lifetime power. Call it your lifetime power. But really, even on a bike, for 5 hours, you could hold a power cycling. So, however, the shape of that curve varies based on your phenotype. So if you're a sprinter, that peak at the beginning is going to be really high, and it's going to be pretty steep. The curve is going to be dropped steeply. Whereas a time trialist, that curve might look pretty flat.
Okay.
So that's sort of the science, the short science answer on that.
Okay. So it basically.
And I definitely.
Go ahead.
I definitely pay attention to that, but you still need, in order to move up the categories, to even use your strength unless you're going to be a time trialist who's not going to race mass start at all.
Yeah. You
still have to have skills to know how to keep yourself safe and have fun in mass start events.
Got it. Okay, so the phenotype is basically just kind of which one of those categories, based on your natural ability to sustain a certain amount of power over time.
Yes.
Yeah, as a distillation, the Reader's Digest version. I'm sure we can have people on who could talk about it for an hour.
It's really which energy systems do you have naturally in abundance over others?
And so for those, are you a believer in working on your weaknesses or really expanding on your strengths? Do you have a philosophy when it comes to those types of things?
I do. And I'm a strength person.
Okay.
I think work on your strengths, use your strengths, focus on your strengths.
Okay.
Yes, you still have to, there are some things within that package of strengths that are stronger than others. And if you want to call that working on your weaknesses, I think at that point it's basically semantics.
Yeah.
But I'm not a believer in, if your phenotype is a time trialist, then probably it's a waste of time for you to do, sprint training all year.
Yeah.
And it certainly isn't going to lead to success in time trials, although it is a misconception that some sprint training is going to beef up that power duration curve and supplement that time trial ability. And then it becomes a degree of, well, how much are you adapting?
Yeah.
And that's what the technologies provided through Training Peaks transitioned with powerful analytics software like WKO5 and things really comes into play.
Okay.
Because you can track the effectiveness of all that.
Okay. So you're a big believer in saying, okay, you're a climber, become a better climber rather than saying you're a climber,
Yes.
go build up your strengths. Okay. But then I'm assuming things like bike handling skills, those types of things are the weaknesses we should all be working on.
Well, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And
For your safety and mine.
Indeed. Yeah. I think a lot of, the first time I got into, I came from I only owned a time trial bike for the first, I think, 8 or so years that I was riding, other than when I was a kid, and I had bikes. But I went from triathlon and then moved to Colorado and then immediately got into cyclocross. And I would say every single time I went around a curve, I was laying on my back. I mean, it was amazing how poor my bike skills were. I never would have. I knew they were bad. I knew they weren't, certainly elite. I mean, it was like I was a kindergarten level bike handler at that point.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's really one of the arguments of what's called the long-term athletic development model too, is that you want kids today to be lifers as sportsmen, whether they reach a high competitive level or not. We want everyone to keep running, to keep riding, to keep swimming. And so there are basic skills in life in general, running, jumping, throwing, but there's also basic bike skills. And yes, if I were your coach and you were a time trialist, I would have wanted you to learn how to corner really well, because actually there are corners in time trials too.
Yeah. So how do you, so kind of going back to these days where again, you get dropped in the parking lot, then you keep up a little bit more and things like that. When does that start to, again, you're kind of going through brute force at this point. You're not taking a scientific approach, it sounds like, to this. At what point do you start, like, are your wheels already turning to saying, okay, how am I putting this together? I'm assuming the notion of you becoming a coach at this point is just like, you might as well become an astronaut. But at what point, like, do you start getting better at riding, and then it starts to transition, like, okay, I'm noticing that this systematic approach is really starting to pay dividends?
Well, remember, what brought me into this was a crisis. So I had to have the big spiritual questions answered first. So I think I touched upon a story where, yes, I was getting dropped in the parking lot. I was making progress, but there weren't those feel good type of outcomes with that progress quite yet. And I was starting to get discouraged because, remember, I had made what I thought was a bad choice, and it had led to a lot of pain and suffering. And I didn't want to do that again in my life. I wanted to be, characterized by good choices, which led to good outcomes. I didn't want to beat myself up against the wall and have nothing to show for it. So I really had a conversation, I think I told you, with God, who was my coach at the time, because the spiritual aspect was the driver, because of how much I had invested in not wanting to make an error, a life error, which is really a spiritual question. I think it's a faith question.
Yeah. So you were almost more afraid of futility at this point than anything else.
Yes. And so I was on my way to yet another race with my little club team as a beginner racer. And I was just kind of like bargaining. And I said, look, if I don't see some results, I'm done. And so, because that'll be a sign to me that I'm not supposed to do this. This is not part of my purpose. And that was the race I had a breakthrough. And I didn't have a breakthrough because of anything special I did. It was the same old thing I did. I used whatever I'd learned that day and built upon it. But I was still there in the field when a dog came out, about to get dropped. When a dog came onto the course, slowed the leaders and the whole peloton down long enough for me to have enough recovery to stay in, and I took 7th place.
Wow.
And I think I told you that, 7 is the number of perfection in Christianity.
Yeah.
It's considered the number of completion. And to me, it was a sign keep at this. Going to lead to something. That was a
Yeah.
big breakthrough day for me.
Huh.
And then it just built from there. And then I think the more looking back, because this was quite a while before I had formal coaching, I think what that led to is just more exposure to more people, more ideas, more reading.
Yeah.
I did start to journal what I was doing at that point. I started to log it in a logbook. I still have all those notebooks. I have so many notebooks because there wasn't an online program like Training Peaks at that time.
Right.
And I just started to keep track of it all. Keeping track of everything seemed important. Yes.
And
I would have to say the structure of it was important for a lot of reasons.
And so like, I mean, some of this is just, as you said, is not necessarily seeing some grand light at the end of the tunnel, like, oh, great, I'm going to go be an elite cyclist now. It's just getting the, I don't know, fortitude or the green light to then go to the next race or go out for the next training session.
Yes, and that point was something that was really startling to me when after I made the transition into coaching. Well, I always ask when I'm working with a new athlete, what is your dream goal? And, I in the beginning, I always expected some big answer.
Yeah.
I want to go to the Olympics or I want to be in the Tour de France. And every time I was shocked by what someone would say. All the goals are different.
Yeah.
All the dreams are different. Some people are just, as you say, well, I want to see where I can get to next.
Yeah.
And then they get there, and then I want to see where we get to next. And even when I provide them with a safe environment of, look, I'm not going to talk to anyone about your dreams. They don't have to be realistic. Just what are they? Even when I pitch it like that, sometimes it's as simple as systematic improvement.
And do you encourage that? Like, have you noticed in the athletes that you've coached, the bigger the dream, the bigger the result, or does it just vary by person?
I do actually. I would have to say there is a linear relationship with how big the dream and how capable they are of achieving it.
Do you sense that, like, the lower the dream, the plateau comes a little bit lower and earlier?
Yes.
Interesting.
I feel like we either know what we're capable of, or our minds constrain us before our work ethic does.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because what tends to get publicized and the stories that we know are these comeback stories. I mean, you don't have to look further than Lance Armstrong. And you wonder, with a guy like that in a story, and because it's not just Lance, there's 1,000 of these stories, whether it's, amputation, sickness, these types of things, where the comeback nearly always seems to be bigger than, like, much bigger, in order of magnitude bigger than what that person would have originally set as a goal, if that makes sense. And
yes,
so I
does.
wonder if that facing death, adversity, whatever it is, so there's just sort of a mental trigger that says, well, if I'm going to come back versus, if I'm just going to take a step forward as a normal story, I'm just going to, I'm going to go from me today to tomorrow. I want to do X race. If I'm laying in a hospital bed or something, and if I have to come all the way back, I basically have like a clean whiteboard in front of me in terms of where I want to put that finish line. It's not just one step in front of me. It could literally be the Olympics. It could be, Ironman, Tour de France, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting.
It is. And in this year of COVID, where we've seen so much loss, I think we have yet to know fully the gains that have been made this year in each of our lives, but also in our progress as in society. The technological advances, what we've learned, I think suffering and loss can always lead to an incredible success.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of the basics of physiology. You toil under a great strain, and then you rest, and there's a compensation, which
Yeah.
leads to a better fitness. So I think suffering and loss and setbacks are kind of like training stress. It's part of it.
That's such a simple analogy. I'd never really thought about it in just in that simple of terms of just you're just sort of tearing down that emotional muscle, and then it's just about rebuilding it.
Yeah, all my favorite athletes are the tough ones that have been through it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I spoke with Eric McElvaney, who's going to be on the podcast, who is a below the leg amputee IED in Afghanistan. It was a very similar thing. And that was one of the questions that I asked him was, the day before or 5 minutes before this happens, you have a life in front of you that probably didn't involve things like Ironmans and marathons and those types of things. And then it's this facing of this tragedy or this opportunity for catharsis that then, leads you all the way back into a completely different life.
Yes.
Yeah.
And before the accident with the deer, I was congratulating myself at how well I was handling the whole COVID period. Yes, I'd had the illness in March, but relatively easy recovery from that.
Okay.
And certainly not like we're hearing on the news and all the tragedies people are experiencing.
Yep.
Even as an athlete, it was not that tragic. It was a typical respiratory illness type of re-ramp and comeback.
Which certainly seems to be the case most often. That certainly what we have seen in the data, in the news, et cetera, is that fitness and health is absolutely the way through this.
Yes, but I was kind of coasting at that point because now don't get me wrong, I was training and I was training in a structured way, and I was training toward a goal, a very big goal in the future, a tangible goal with a date. However, when I got and I was actually I was finally coming into that feeling as an athlete where you are on top of the gear and you just know that your power is coming. Finally, you have trained to the point that now your training can lead to some really significant progress.
Okay.
It is so rare to feel that because sometimes in training, physiologically, you're kind of slogging through it, even with proper recovery. And then there are these periods in training where you're breaking through. And I was on the cusp of that. Even on that ride that day, I was seeing some remarkable things in my data. And that's why as soon as it happened, even before I hit the road after T-boning the deer, I was heartbroken because I was about to go really hard up a hill to set a new best in a power goal I had after so much fatigue, after so many kilojoules. And I couldn't do it because I was thwarted by this deer herd. And so I was heartbroken about that. But my heartbreak lasted probably about 6 hours.
Okay.
In the hospital, I have never had a break that serious, and breaking your pelvis is pretty serious.
Yeah.
It was a stable fracture, which means it didn't involve surgery, but still, I couldn't put any kind of pressure on the pedals for 12 weeks.
Wow.
That's a long time for an athlete who is just on the wave, the cusp of experiencing something remarkable for the first time after years of working on it again. And I was really heartbroken in the hospital, so I asked for a chaplain. Again, I had the spiritual question: is this some kind of sign? Here I am about to break through again.
Yeah.
And I have this incredible setback. does that mean I'm on the wrong path? And the chaplain, she was awesome. She said, you know what? God doesn't just speak to you on your worst days. He also speaks to you on your best days. Was he telling you before the deer came out and caused this crash that you should stop? And I was like, oh no, I was about to hit it like I haven't hit it for years.
Yeah.
And she said, well, then I don't think that this is a sign. I think it's just a random suffering in a year where people are having great loss.
Yeah.
And this is, I'm getting emotional. This is a way that I can relate to them.
Interesting. Yeah. So I guess if you're gonna listen on the good days, you have to listen on the bad days, right? The positive signs.
Right.
Yeah.
And so but what I also felt in the hospital was, yes, I had been training structured before, but I kind of was dilly-dallying, waiting to see what was going to happen. As I was shocked, but they got me on my feet within 24 hours and asked me to start physical therapy.
Wow.
And from that moment, I was like, that's it. I'm drilling it.
Okay.
Now I'm serious. Okay. It really ignited that time is short. You don't know what's coming. You better take advantage of it when you've got it. And I can't dilly-dally now.
Yeah. So that's a perfect transition then. Okay, so let's talk about the not dilly-dallying, because I really want to dig in a little bit to not only your methodology as a coach, but just in coaching in general, the structure of how to, yours is going to be obviously specific to bike. We just had Claire Bird on the podcast a couple episodes ago where she hit a PR in the marathon because she had never done speed work, never been on a track, never been on, looking at speed work at all. And it was a pretty big gain. It was like a 20-minute PR on the marathon. Wow. Yeah, and so I want to talk specifically about when you're sort of up on this, broken pelvis and thinking about your recovery, and you're thinking to yourself, all right, I'm done dilly-dallying. I'm going to approach this. I'm going to attack this. Again, you're eating your own dog food. You know how to coach, and so therefore you know how to train. You know the inputs and what the outputs should be. So let's talk a little bit about the inputs, how you train. Let's talk a little bit maybe about periodization and things like that and some of those concepts, because I suspect a lot of people listening to this just, they do what most of us do, which is I'll go for a long run or a long ride. I'll sprint up that hill, but there's no real structure to it and no understanding of what that structure can bring and the magic that it can unlock.
Okay. Well, periodization is basically structured training coupled with structured rest. And periodization is proven. It's decades and decades of research of showing the benefits of structured training. And along with this idea of structured training or periodized training comes the concept of working on various energy systems, when and how much and how long. Because in road cycling, you do have an end sprint. But you also may have a long climb or a hard section that requires tempo threshold type fitness. You also might have syncopated type racing, like in crits, where there's a lot of speed changes. But even in a road race, there can be speed changes or a lot of variability of effort. Okay. And so you have to train multiple systems, energy systems, and some of those systems kind of compete with each other. This is very simplistic physiology. It's much more complicated than that. They all work together too, but they kind of, if you work one, then you may lose a little in another. And so it's really what hasn't been proven is what is the best periodization scheme. Okay. And the difficulties of trying to prove that are have to do with how you set that up and who's going to be willing to let you experiment on them long term like that. But some of the principles of physiology we already know. Variation works, rest works, overload works. And so periodization is typically a plan which takes those physiological principles and puts them into a structure that addresses the athletic demand of whatever your goal is.
Okay.
That's sort of the general way to put it.
Okay. So does let me give you what I understand about periodization, and then you can correct me from where that is. So typically, you would pick kind of an end date. So call it an A race. And then let's say that's 4 months out, or say 6 months out. Then you work backward from there, and you start to determine which systems you're going to be working. So you might start out with a lot of base work, kind of long, consistent days, intermixing in recovery, which I do want to dive into recovery in just a second and how important that is, because I think that is far and away the most overlooked piece of this. And so I might, again, my training then changes slowly or gradually week by week over that 6 month period, where I'm sort of transitioning maybe from long, slow endurance type stuff all the way leading into where then I'm doing some harder, speed work, those types of things. And I've broken my season down into different periods where I'm working different systems.
Yes, that's in general what I'm talking about. Now, there's much debate about what base looks like these days.
Okay.
There is a lot of individual variability based on unique phenotype, an individual characteristics of physiology. There's still principles that can be followed in general, but we have so much data at our disposal today, and so many good tools to help track what's really going on, that I'm starting to move away from certain periodization schemes I favored in the past to individualizing the periodization based on their personal metrics, and that's
is that as simple as saying, like, if I've already got a pretty good engine for distance, then you might just focus more on things like speed and that type of thing, or like what individually am I bringing to the table that you might look at?
Well, let me give you two separate example athletes. One athlete is a high level executive in a big company, who has limited time to train. With his periodization is undulating, because I can get him periods of volume and load at specific times, and then his work demands become overwhelming, and at other times I cannot get him as much load and volume. So it's very challenging to do a build towards something with that, but I can still make gains with him using an undulating pattern. As long as the principle of overload still applies, and I'm looking at his personal data to make sure that we're still making gains. If I undulate his periodization, I can make gains. I could not put him on a strict linear periodization program like I could with a junior athlete who has very, very few outside commitments, can say I'm going to be riding 8 hours in December, but by July I'm going to be riding 14 hours, and there's pretty much nothing that's going to hinder that.
Got it. Okay.
From happening. So
talk about overload.
Yeah. So overload is a principle of physiology. It's kind of like you have to have so much work in order to stress your body enough to get a training adaptation via rest.
Okay.
And then once you do that, you should see a progression. So what many non-coached athletes tend to do is go out and do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And which often involves a lot of group rides, or if you're an introvert, maybe it involves a lot of solo rides and not enough group rides. But it's kind of the same, and they think year after year, I'm going to get better because I'm building on this basis of the same. Well, you may get better because your skills get better. your confidence grows, your technical abilities get better. You may become more efficient. But in terms of creating overload for continual gain, it's not going to happen. You can't do the same thing and expect that. There has to be varying demand on, increasing over time.
So how do I know when I'm properly overloading in the right areas? Like this is where I think, what you just said, I'm totally guilty of, which is I kind of have a vague notion, like I've got a long, slow day, I've got a kind of a tempo day, I've got a speed day, but I don't have any real clue. Am I running long enough? Am I running slow or fast enough? Am I running enough intervals? So this is where I think a coach and a tool like, again, like a Training Peaks or something, can really, well, not even can help. You sort of need this in a way to really dial in. Like, yes, you are now scientifically starting to move those dials versus just randomly throwing levers, which is frankly what I always feel like I'm doing in my training.
Well, we're tracking data that represents physiological systems. And along with that, we're also tracking your recovery. There are metrics within it that show improvement and that show overload.
Okay.
So let's come back to that because you want to know about that. Do I have time or do you want to go straight to recovery metrics?
Whichever one makes sense to talk about first. I'll leave it in your hands. We've got time to talk both for sure.
On the training side, so you're doing a long day, a speed day, and you mentioned something else, but how do you know that that's what you need? So what I can do is I can look at what you're doing and I can tell you if you're gaining an adaptation from that by looking at, can you hold that same pace, shall we call it? And in our sport, cycling, we use power, but can you hold that same pace and have an improved heart rate or show central adaptations in other ways? Rate of perceived exertion is less. Can you, in the long ride, can you hold that same heart rate and that same pace 3 hours after you've been doing it? Or is there a change there? And there are metrics to track that.
Okay.
On your speed day, first of all, are you adapting to this kind of speed work, this particular interval at all? You may not be. You may not have the physiological components to adapt that much to that. And is that choice costing you somewhere else?
Oh, explain that. So is this like a slow twitch versus a fast twitch type of thing? Or explain that. I'd never really thought about the idea that I'm doing work that may not benefit me at all.
So I'm a small, lean woman. And I could do sprint training every day, and I'm not going to be able to excel on the track in any kind of sprint event.
Okay.
I'm just not going to adapt to that. I don't have that physiological profile.
But would your sprint days not help you like on a climb, let's say? Like building that sprint power, does that, or is it just sort of a nominal, like you'd be better off doing this type of workout?
It's true. Some anaerobic power work with full recovery called anaerobic capacity, and some anaerobic work with short recoveries can make me a better climber. But to what degree, how long do I need to do it? What other things could I be doing with a greater benefit? Yeah. All that can be tracked with metrics.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess that's the point is that, sure, it will help you, but if you were to do this exercise, it would help you 3 times as much.
Exactly.
Wow.
And it might work other stuff too. That helps you also. Yeah.
Okay. I'm getting sold here. I worked with a coach very briefly when I first started doing triathlons, and I couldn't tell how much of it was the coaching versus just kind of coming off the couch, where I had a sort of, I was going to the gym and things, but it's easy to make those big gains early. And so I couldn't really tell how much of it was just, well, you're just moving and therefore you're improving. But in retrospect, I will say I never had the kind of gains that I had then, where somebody was looking at my data, looking at my workouts, ensuring that I was doing. And this was probably about half as scientific as it needed to be. Like we weren't using a Training Peaks, or we weren't really analyzing the data. It was just more kind of analyzing. Like we would do a time trial test, I think like once every 3 months, let's say, and then we would just kind of analyze heart rate and things like that.
Yes. Yeah. Having that accountability. And also, if you're investing time and resources towards someone to hold you accountable,
Yeah.
you don't want to waste that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It shows a level of commitment.
And I think that that's probably what I hear get brought up most of all with a coach, is just the accountability. And I think that while that is very important, the other side, though, is all the things that you've started to explain here, which are, where you start to get scientific and saying, great that you want to do intervals, but maybe intervals aren't the right thing for you to reach your sub 3 hour marathon, let's say.
The accountability word is thrown around a lot in a lot of the coaching articles I've read about why do you need a coach. But the truth is, I never think of myself as holding people accountable. I don't. To me, I am not a Catholic nun with a ruler. Like, I'm not going to beat you. What I see myself more is coming alongside as a teacher.
Okay.
And guiding you toward what is best specifically for you, and I expect you to help you figure that out.
Yeah, and I would assume if that's what you need, maybe there's other things standing in your way. Maybe coaching isn't where you are. Like if you need to be motivated, maybe either you're in the wrong sport or you're, I don't know, looking at your goals all wrong, or whatever.
I wouldn't go so far to say that, because honestly, almost everybody that comes to me for coaching has a problem that needs to be solved. And they're all highly motivated people, but we all get into these situations. Look, I could have sat in that hospital room and been completely demotivated.
Sure.
To keep trying. If I didn't have the knowledge about how I could get myself out of that situation. But if you gain the knowledge, or someone comes along beside you and just believes that you can gain the knowledge and that they can help you be encouraged doing the work.
Yeah.
That's a game changer. And so I hate to say that I don't work with unmotivated people. I'm not I used to have kind of a high-minded view of myself. Oh, I'm not a cheerleader. I'm a coach. I work with highly motivated elites. Ooh. But the truth is, most people are highly motivated by the time they come to me. They just don't know what's affecting their motivation.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I guess my point was like you're being a cheerleader versus being somebody who is trying to organize an intervention is there's a big difference between the two.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's talk about, I think I understand the principles of all of the work that you're putting into your body. Let's talk for a second about rest, because that is an area where I know, like the feeling that you had before you T-boned the deer, I've been in that situation where you just have this amazing workout and your instinct is to go do that again. Like, man, I felt great. Yeah. I'm either going to go longer or I'm going to do it again tomorrow, and I'm just going to drive myself right into the ground. So let's talk a little bit about rest.
Well, we are so blessed in our world today to have smart people that figured out this whole thing about heart rate variability and how to track it in a non-invasive way. Mm-hmm. So the idea of resting heart rate and taking it every morning has been around a long time, but who wants to do that? Yeah. Like, by the time I took my resting heart rate in the mornings myself, my heart rate would be high because I was stressed trying to take my resting heart rate. So, because it's sympathetic, it's autonomic nervous system drive that is really what heart rate variability is tracking. And that is, you're either being driven more by your sympathetic system, the fight and flight system, or you're being driven by the parasympathetic system, which is rest, digest, freeze. Okay. So heart rate variability is proving to be highly accurate in letting you know when your central system is pretty much ready for the next day's strain. Now, it's not perfect, and but it is pretty close, and I relied on it I relied on these metrics very heavily. I think you read the article that Training Peaks put during my COVID experience, what the recovery metrics were looking like. There were dramatic inexplicable changes that the company whose device I was working with Whoop tracked and found out that those metrics were predicting the presence of COVID.
Interesting.
So, yeah, so I'm still learning about it. But what I've seen over time, so I relied on the metrics very heavily in the beginning because I was afraid to create too much overload in the early days of COVID. We just didn't know what was going on, right?
Right.
So I was afraid to create too much overload in my athletes for two reasons. One, we didn't know when events were going to come back online. You don't want to drive someone silly way too early.
Okay.
But secondly, what were the implications of getting COVID for everyone? We just didn't know. And my thing was, if you're gonna get COVID because you don't have any immunity.
Okay.
Training hard to protect your immunity. Training too hard and worrying about it putting you in some kind of immunity danger is pointless because we don't have immunity at all to this particular strain of, disease. However, I didn't want you exhausted having to fight this unknown strain of disease.
Right.
So I was using the metrics very heavily and religiously in the beginning. If it said green, we trained. If it said amber, we modified. If it said red, we rested.
Wow. Okay. And it's just that binary. So it's you're looking, or not binary, but it's that clear where your resting heart rate is that big an indicator for pending danger.
It is. Now, there are some limitations. My legs aren't always recovered, meaning metabolic product has not flushed enough, and or my muscular glycogen has not repleted enough after hard training day after day to go out and train again. I might have a green score because now I'm centrally adapted. So my cardiovascular, my heart rate variability, my heart is saying, yeah, you're ready.
Okay.
But sometimes the legs don't follow.
Okay.
And that's a big flaw with following the data religiously, because I can get a whole week of green scores, but I cannot go out and do, say, 3-minute intervals every day.
Okay.
My legs just won't do it,
Okay.
And we've seen this from the Tour de France data too, with the heart rate variability metrics. They are doing big scores, big daily strains day after day. And the heart rate variability is tracking that, but you still might not have the legs, even if the score is showing you recovered, to be able to execute. So there is a lag with the legs.
Okay. And so is this where something like RPE comes in, rate of perceived exertion, where you
absolutely.
Yeah. So in
heart rate.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to qualify. In the era of power, many people, including myself, kind of threw heart rate aside for a long time. But heart rate variability shows me, and also some of the trainings I do now that are heart rate based versus power based to force a particular adaptation, have shown me just how valuable heart rate is as a component of training. And also the rate of perceived exertion. I mean, you need that anyway. You need to be able to say, I'm not feeling it today. I don't care if my green score says 91% and my legs feel ready. I'm just not feeling it. And you need to pay attention to that. And you need that self-knowledge in races too.
Yeah. So when you say you modify, then does that become, we're not going to do an interval day today? Does that mean we're going to do shorter intervals or less power? Does it depend on how yucky you feel in the legs?
Yeah, all those things.
Yeah.
You can there's many ways to manipulate load. The other thing that's really cool about these recovery metrics, which is unexpected, is I've been amazed at how many days I could train hard versus following even some of the best experts giving talks will give you a sample week of what it looks like. Now they're giving you a general sample. They're not working with you specifically. But if you followed the best experts, best example of a week, you might not be training as hard as you can based on your own metrics.
Yeah, I was going to.
And that's what's been astounding to me.
Yeah, sorry. I was going to ask, like, have you woken up on a certain day or had one of your athletes wake up on a certain day and been like, oh, I'm way overtrained. There's no way that I can do it. And then you look at your data and it just kind of gives you that level of confidence. You know what I mean?
Some days, when you're programmed and structured, you sort of look forward to your rest day. And I've kind of given up the attachment to that and been a little bit more flexible in the sense that I might have a rest day planned, but if I come into the rest day with a big score and I've got the legs, I'm going to change it.
Okay.
And I've been doing that for my athletes too.
Cool.
And also it has changed what our rest days look like. That's another cool thing.
Meaning
so
how?
It has. Well, I've gone from sort of what I call adaptation or regeneration days, and you do need those where it's just simply you're doing the neuromuscular pattern of whatever sport you're in. You're jogging lightly as a runner, or you're riding 30 minutes easy on the rollers for the bike, or just a coffee ride or something. But for some don't need it to be that easy at various times. Sometimes I can introduce some structure even in the recovery day. And then I can work a system that we didn't expect.
Okay. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we did this because I had my suspicions. I mean, we all know, again, it's what I started out the conversation with, which is we all know intuitively and empirically that coaching is something that we take on in so many other parts of our lives where we bring in an expert to tell us how to do something. We often lack that accountability side of while that expert is telling us what to do, we're measuring and making sure that it's effective. But I think it's been really fascinating talking to you and understanding a little bit better how variable that data is and how, I guess, specifically it can guide your recovery, your load, your workouts, all of those things, and start to achieve goals on a whole different scale than just sort of going everything by feel.
It is. And if you've taken nothing away from this conversation, by now you know that my approach is holistic. I'm dealing with the whole organism, body, soul, spirit, mind, all of it. And the beautiful thing about the recovery metrics is you can capture the life stress. So in my VIP client, who's a high-level executive manager for a major company, I can capture his work stress. For one of my treasured but somewhat emotionally unstable client who has a lot of relational stress, I can now capture that.
Wow.
And modify their training for it.
And is this all through something like Whoop?
Yep.
Okay. So help me on that one real quick. So not that I want to turn this into a commercial for Whoop, but something like an Apple Watch that is going to measure your heart rate and just give you the raw data. I'm assuming then Whoop that then just takes that the next level and then gives you back an analysis of that data.
Whoop has a lot of different metrics. It's their space. It's their niche space. So they're an expert at it. I'm pretty sold on them, but there are a variety of competitors. You're right. What I like about them in particular is how easy and applied everything is. I got a degree in physiology so I could apply it, not so that I could explain all the science really well. There are other people who are much better at that. And Whoop is really good at applying it and putting it in user-friendly little graphs and stuff. I have one athlete that calls it her tattle bracelet.
Oh, nice.
She can't fudge not getting good sleep anymore.
That's funny.
She can't. Wow. You can't lie to yourself about how good your sleep hygiene is.
Yeah, sleep is definitely an area where and I'm sure a lot of people, especially these days with so much going on, definitely struggle with.
Yes.
Yeah, it's so damn important. I know these things. These things, Beth. I just need to get cracked over the head once in a while.
Well, a good coach helps you see the light, helps you know what to look for, shortcuts the process, and puts your attention where it needs to be.
There you go. I think that's well said.
And helps you grow and enjoy the process.
Yeah.
That's really what it's about.
Well, that's great.
And then give back to everyone around you.
How many athletes do you typically train or coach at any given time?
I am not a Walmart coach. I am not a big business owner. I am a boutique coach who works with private, small few.
Okay.
I keep it small. Because I really work with them. I develop pretty strong relationships. They trust me with a lot of personal information, and I like to be involved in the development process, whether that's your beginner, recreational, weekend warrior who then becomes a master's, national level, or even world level athlete, or if you're a promising junior who signs a pro contract. I like to be involved in that development process. And I think to do that well requires a lot of attention to each individual. And I want to give that. Yeah.
How long does somebody typically work with you? Do you have clients who you've been working years with, or is it something that kind of ebbs and flows with how their season's going? What's a typical profile in a relationship with one of your athletes?
I typically work with people for years.
Okay.
There was a time when I had high turnover, but that was more about me learning what kind of client I wanted to work with than it was the client themselves, I think.
Yeah.
And then there are a few who come and go. And I also do some consulting type projects. I also work with teams. I have a UCI sport director license as well. I sometimes work with teams and or groups. And I also sometimes run clinics. I love teaching what I call race side, or being right there with you. I love that. That's one of my faves. So I make room for that. And that's why I keep my core group of clients small. Any big business owner, coaches who are listening to this were thinking to themselves, well, how is she making money? Well, exactly. This has always been a spiritual thing for me. It's always been a mission and my purpose, and the resources take care of themselves.
Got it.
Yeah.
Last question on this then is, you talked about kind of building the fundamentals first at the start of our conversation here. If obviously you can't coach them all, and
right,
would you recommend somebody? So let's say I'm just getting into running. I want to run a marathon, let's say. I've set that as my goal. Would you recommend getting into like hire the coach today, get the fundamentals down, do it that way versus, do a Hal Ligdon training plan, sort of, do a guided tour type of thing until you really maybe hit a different level of commitment or achievement or whatever else?
I think to answer your question, so.
And I don't mean to make it about the marathon, obviously. I mean, biking, so
Yeah.
like even talking about like bike handling skills, maybe. So would you throw in there, well, first I would go to a clinic and start learning some real bike handling skills first before I, like if you only have money, let's say to, I'm going to go do Disney marathon. I know that's going to cost me a couple of grand to go down there and stay and do that in 6 months. And in the meantime, where should I spend my money to get the most bang for the buck, I guess, for, to achieve my first marathon potential?
Oh,
Or
wow, that's
first
a
bike
difficult
race.
question.
Yeah.
Let me put it into bike racing terms because
Please do. Yeah.
it's an easier context for me to think it through. So let's say someone wants to go do their first Grand Fondo.
Okay.
And let's say that they've already got a certain level of equipment. So let's say that expenditure is already made.
Okay.
I'm going to assume if they've already made that expenditure and they've chosen that as a goal, they already have a cycling community of some sort too.
Okay. Local
group riders or someone who they've been riding with that explains what they're doing.
So I guess really steps 1 and 2 by what you're saying is make sure you've got some halfway decent equipment where that isn't a liability. 2, get into your community, get on some group rides or whatever is applicable to whatever, if you're doing a Fondo or a cyclocross race or a mountain bike race or whatever, but get into that community and start doing some of those rides.
Yes.
Okay.
Get out there and do it. Meet the other people who do it. Talk to the other people. Now, there's a ton of information these days. We know that. Not all of it's good. Again, a coach can help you sort through that.
Yep.
But cycling is a skills-oriented thing. You can really hurt yourself and others without good skill. So I would say put your money into skills and how to do that. You can hire a coach for it. You can attend a clinic or a camp.
Okay.
Maybe it's joining your local club and they're teaching you skills. If you're a beginner and you're just starting, obviously you need to ride for a while.
Yeah.
You need to ride a bit. You need to understand what it's like to be in a group and what the skills are. That's where I would put my first bit of resources and attention.
Yep, fair enough. Well, cool. Well, it was super fun sitting down and diving into this. Again, I had my suspicions and they've all been confirmed. So I'm going to definitely be on the hunt for this.
Well, I hope it was valuable information, Troy. I don't know. And forgive me for interrupting you several times.
It's always tough when we're doing the phone calls always have just enough latency to kind of step on each other with that. So if it ever sounded like that, I think that's just more a symptom of the latency in the line. But I really appreciate you coming on. I will post a link in the show notes to the article that you wrote on Training Peaks because that was what absolutely sold me on having you on. It really, just reading that article kind of changed my view of coaching in a way. Like you did it in an extremely digestible way. How you dove into your data, your sleep data, your recovery data, those types of things. You saw COVID coming in your own body, those types of things. So it is a really profound, I think, very concise article, and I'll definitely put it in the show notes for you.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Of that.
Indeed.
Yes.
Indeed. Well, we're just coming across the finish line. So any last parting words of wisdom for our listeners?
I think everyone out there, be strong, take heart, hope. We've had some hard times, but we're going to come back stronger, faster, hopefully smarter, and most importantly, kinder.
Let's hope. Well said.
Yeah.
Yeah, well said, Beth. Thank you very much. Well, everybody,
you.
that is the show. I hope you enjoyed it. More people racing more often, having more fun in the process is our mission at Athlinks. Thanks again for Beth Leasure-Hudson enlightening us about coaching. The best way to support this podcast is to be sure to click subscribe on iTunes or follow on Spotify to be notified of the new shows. And please take just a couple of minutes to give us a 5-star rating and a quick review on iTunes. So we do a special post for each episode on Instagram. Look for the post for episode 22 with a picture of Beth. If you have any comments or questions, or we are at Athlinks, or just shoot us an email at podcast@athlinks.com. Share it with friends far and wide to help spread the word. And until next time, happy racing, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
No, thank you. That was great.